All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin our afternoon session of Capstone presentations. And our next presenter is Brendan McElroy, and the title of his capstone paper is Regional Regime Diversity and Social Policy Priorities, Evidence from Russia.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sim. I'm happy to be here making this presentation today. The paper has gone through quite a few iterations so far over just the past few months, but the kind of common thread throughout has been trying to identify the relationship between how competitive or how open regional regimes are in Russia and the structure of social policy that these types of regimes enact. So in other words, do more democratic regions behave differently in terms of social policy priorities from more authoritarian regions? And so, I use Russia as the kind of case in the regions to get analytical leverage on this question, but it also relates to sort of broader questions of social policy outside of developed countries. So is it actually democracies or more authoritarian regimes that, first of all, do they behave differently in terms of social policy? And does one type of regime enact more redistributive policies than another? So that is basically my two research questions here. The first is just sort of the test to identify whether there are significant differences between more democratic and more authoritarian regional regimes in Russia. And the second is sort of a question about one of the implications. And this is whether electoral competition, so one of the major kind of institutional aspects of democracy, leads to policy making that is more redistributive or actually worsens the kind of redistributive consequences of social policy. And why we might think that would be the case, I will go into in just a second. Because there's quite a bit of theory on this, both derived from developed countries and the developing world, and the post-communist world as well. So we know pretty conclusively that democracies commit to higher levels of social spending than authoritarian regimes, even when controlling for economic development and a host of other factors. We also know that social spending in developing countries, I say democracies here, but really developing countries, authoritarian and democratic, is often regressive in terms of its consequences. So it actually worsens income distributions, it provides social goods and services to a narrow stratum of the population, usually kind of organized formal sector urban workers, civil servants, the military, and so on. So that is one reason why we might expect that more democratic regional regimes would actually do worse in terms of how redistributive social policy is. On the other hand, we have the kind of formal theory associated with Bruce Guido de Mesquita, the kind of selectorate theory or logic of political survival, which basically models social policy as a public good and argues that democracies are more likely to provide public goods than are authoritarian regimes, because for an authoritarian ruler it's more cost-effective to supply private goods to the handful of people that he relies on to stay in power. As the size of the selectorate increases, at some point it becomes more cost-efficient to provide sort of universalistic public goods instead of trying to supply all of your needed supporters with private goods. So that's the theory. And just in addition to that, there's any number of other factors that we might expect would influence the structure of social spending or social policy priorities. And by that I mean, before I go any further, let me just say by social policy priorities I really mean kind of, what share of social spending goes to pensions, what share goes to education, what share goes to healthcare, what share goes to consumer subsidies, what share goes to other social transfers, various things like that. So it's not about levels of social spending so much as what areas of spending a government chooses to prioritize. And this is likely to be affected by any number of things: how severe the fiscal pressures on the government are, the age structure and the demographic pressures on the population, its level of economic development. There's a strain in the literature. It actually comes from this sort of varieties of capitalism literature on advanced OECD countries that argues that social policy choices are very closely linked to kind of the broader national political economy and development strategy. So that's another factor we might expect. And then finally, political regime. And not simply democracy versus autocracy as I have it here, but treating regime type as a continuum. What relationship would we expect between the structure of social spending and different points on that continuum? So hypotheses. The sort of general hypothesis, which relates to the first research question, is that high democracy and low democracy regions should be associated with distinct social policy priorities. And this should hold in the empirical analysis against the null hypothesis, which basically says no, regime type does not matter. Many of those things that we saw in the last slide, fiscal pressures, age structure, development strategy, those actually explain all of the variation, or most of the variation in social policy choices. So that's the null hypothesis. More specifically, and relating to the second research question, it's interesting because the theoretical literature actually gives two hypotheses that are more or less contradictory, but both equally plausible, I think, based on the theory that's available. So the first, which comes from the sort of idea that social policies in developing countries are often regressive, is that more democratic regions where politicians face this electoral logic, they're trying to build a support base, they're trying to get reelected, so they're going to prioritize social policies that yield the most concentrated returns in terms of getting people to vote for them. They're going to promote policies that sort of cater to specific, well-defined, organized groups, or at least potentially organized groups, and are direct transfers. So something like pensions. There are other examples as well. In the Russian case, just because of how social spending works, it's mostly pensions. And the idea is that more democratic regions will prioritize these kinds of targeted investments in social policy over more sort of welfare-enhancing policies. They might actually do more for the population in the long run, but they have diffuse constituencies. Right? You don't sort of get a constituency of pensioners acting the same way as you do a constituency of people who benefit from a well-functioning healthcare system. People who potentially get sick and can use state-provided healthcare is a much more difficult group to organize because it's much more diffuse than pensioners who get a check every month. But then we also have the contrary hypothesis, which is that high democracy regions will actually prioritize investments in more universalistic social policies. And it's basically investments in human capital, health and education. This comes again from the Bruce Bueno de Mesquita sort of theory that social policies are public goods, and as regimes become more democratic, the sort of balance of public versus private goods shifts increasingly in favor of public. So two hypotheses that are not necessarily, they're not directly contradictory, but insofar as they represent different priorities, are in many ways kind of contradictory to each other. Now I'll move on to the case selection. So obviously I chose Russia, and I chose the subnational level for a number of reasons. Subnational comparison is great because we control for all factors that vary at the national level, basically. So things like national economic development strategy. Not to say there aren't differences in economic policy among the regions, but they're much less pronounced than those between at the national level. So you control for a host of things like that. You've got pretty significant variation in the Russian case along the dependent variable, which is the structure of social spending, and the independent variable, which is the nature of the regime, alike. I'll talk more about the nature of these subnational regimes in just a minute, but just to finish up here, we can measure regime type as a continuous variable instead of just a dichotomous variable. It's either democracy or authoritarianism. No reason you can't do this if your units of analysis are countries as well, but it's easier and I think yields better results in a case of subnational analysis because you have substantial regime diversity, but it's still contained. in kind of a part of the overall, spectrum of political regimes. So I'm doing a quantitative analysis. I'm also going to do some tracing of causal mechanisms, qualitative work as well that I'll talk about more later on. This is really more of a plausibility probe than anything else. But so I'm looking at regime effects on social policy priorities. One of the big questions is, how do we measure social policy priorities? If you look at, say, social spending, or spending on pensions, spending on education, all of these different areas, say as a share of GRP, of gross regional product, or just as a share or per capita spending on health, education, these different policy areas. I don't think this is actually a very good indicator of priorities, because the regions differ dramatically in terms of their capacity to finance their budgets, and the degree to which they depend on federal transfers to finance these budgets. So I liked, and I'm using this idea of policy priorities being measured by spending shares. I have looked at spending shares, so different spending items as shares of the consolidated regional budget, and spending shares of just the social policy budget, and I'm not ultimately sure theoretically which is the better one of those to go with. Here I use consolidated regional budget. So I look at education spending, health spending, communal services spending, which in the Russian context basically means utilities, subsidies, consumer subsidies, and subsidized rents for housing as well, and then pensions. Actually, in the empirical part I have so far only deals with education and health. So bear with me, the rest of it is coming at some point. And the independent variable, which is the character of the regional regime, I measure this in two different ways, using two different kind of indices of democracy. The first is, well, actually they're both compiled by Moscow Carnegie Center. The first is a sort of expert assessment of how democratic regions are. They have a baseline for the 1990s. There's also a measure from 2000 to 2004. And the way this is constructed is it's an additive index of 10 items relating to a broad range of things associated with democracy. So civil society, political pluralism, how competitive elections are, judicial independence, and so on and so on. Just in order to just sort of enhance the robustness of the results and make sure they're not just an artifact of this one measure of democracy, I also use an index which is based on actual objective indicators of the level of electoral competition from region to region. And I use the 1991 to 2001 baseline. Again, I can talk more about the measures and the questions. I want to get to the results. But it is a legitimate question. What measures of democracy you use. Actually, if you look at these two, they're correlated pretty significantly at like the 0.61 level or something like that. So it's not as though the expert scores come out of nowhere. And you also see that if you look at the maps. So this is the expert rating, 2000 to 2004. The one thing that's important here is that higher values indicate more democratic regions. And that's contrasted to the objective ratings in which smaller values indicate higher levels of electoral competition. So that's important to keep in mind when we see the results, right? There are two different sort of directionalities here. But just looking back and forth, you can see there's a fair amount of overlap or correlation in terms of which regions have the most electoral competition and which are considered to be rated on these 10 criteria more democratic and which are more authoritarian. Now, also controls I'm including, a large number of them because there are a lot of factors that vary from region to region. Obviously, economic development is one. Dependency ratio, which is a Rosstat measure of the ratio of the number of employed persons to current pensioners. So that's one way of capturing kind of the demographic stress on the regional welfare state, as is this other measure of pensioners per 1,000 population, and as, in fact, is under 16 population share. though we would expect, if we're looking at education, under 16 population share is probably going to have a significant effect. If we're looking at health, well, probably primarily pensioners, maybe also to some extent under 16 population share. I include a measure of ethnic fractionalization or ethnic diversity from region to region, because we know from kind of the theoretical literature on redistribution and public goods that all else being equal, regions or polities with higher levels of ethnic diversity, individual preferences for redistribution may be affected by the level of ethnic diversity in a society. You may not want to redistribute or invest in universalistic public goods if you think that people of the other ethnicity will be getting them. So I did control for that. And also because we have evidence of this sort of subnational resource curse. Whether it's actually a curse is up for debate, and I don't want to talk about that here. But just considering that natural resource output has a lot of impact on how regional political economies are structured, I include a measure of output as a share of gross regional product for 2004-2005. I would like to find figures from the 1990s, but I can't find the equivalent data yet. I'm still looking. Actually, if anyone has any suggestions where I might look for that, that would be nice. And another way of capturing budgetary pressures and specifically dependence on Moscow to fund social policy expenditures is central transfers. So federal transfers as a share of regional budget expenditures for this period. And then I include dummy variables for Moscow and Petersburg because they're federal cities, they have special status, and also for the national republics, which actually I'm defining here as republics, autonomous regions, autonomous districts, anything that is attached to a certain non-Russian nationality. So, findings so far, education and health mostly, but if you look at and by the way, the method is just it's a simple multivariate regression. So this is just sort of a plausibility probe. I am making causal claims, but the quantitative evidence is supposed to really kind of illustrate them rather than actually describe the mechanisms. That'll be more of kind of the meat of the paper. So if you look here, we have electoral competitiveness on the x-axis and education spending as a budget share on the y-axis. It's electoral competitiveness during the 1990s. So the goal is to see how this affects education spending during the 2000s. These are the different regions. I think there are about 75 of them up here. So as you can see, there's a lot of variation. And it does have a linear trend line with a very small r squared. But so it's not immediately obvious whether regional regime type affects education budget shares. And again, remember, so electoral competitiveness, smaller values mean more competitiveness, so it's actually the more competitive regions that are devoting larger budget shares to education. But when we do actual multivariate analysis, you get a pretty, consistent result showing that the different measures of democracy both have the right signs and at a very high confidence level are associated with higher levels of education spending. So if you look at the electoral competitiveness measure up here, again the sign is negative, as expected, because smaller values indicate more competitiveness. Down here I have the two expert scores. I looked at 1991 to 2001. Positive sign because these larger values are more democratic. And also democracy score for 2000 to 2004. It's interesting that this may be reading a little too much into it, but this is only significant at the 5% level, whereas the other measures of democracy are significant at a higher level of confidence. So democracy during the 2000s, the early 2000s, doesn't seem to be related to outcomes in terms of education spending as strongly as democracy or the character of regimes during the 1990s. And if you just look at what else shows up as significant, it's pretty much what you would expect. Under 16 population share, not surprisingly, is highly significant in all of the models. Kind of strangely, it's not strange that pensioners is significant, but it's strange that it has a positive sign. So actually the more pensioners per 1,000 population, the higher level of education spending you get, which I'm not quite sure why that is. It doesn't show up. It shows up sometimes in the models. In other ones I've run, it doesn't show up at all. Sometimes it shows up at the 5% level, sometimes at the 10% level. In any case, never shows up at the 1% level. And then finally, just turn your attention to the ethnic fractionalization measure. Not significant except in one model, but it does have the right sign. So we see that ethnic fractionalization does seem to be possibly, maybe, associated with lower levels of investment in education. What I do then is take the expert scores apart. You disaggregate it into its 10 components. I think I have 8 or 9 of them. There's another slide too. So the first one is political openness, and you can see no relationship, or no significant relationship. Electoral fairness, you've got a pretty significant relationship. Political pluralism, weak relationship. Media freedom, civil society, nothing. And then, here we go. Political institutions, also fairly strong correlation. Elites, down here, nothing. Corruption and local government autonomy, maybe something there. And you'll also see the pensioners models again. Occasionally it's significant, but not at a very high level of confidence. So, I don't think, I think it's just an anomaly of the data. So anyway, this is the disaggregated index. I also have measures for health, which are actually much more preliminary, so I'm not going to talk about them in depth. The model is not very good, and it doesn't actually explain that much variation, but at least electoral competitiveness is significant and with the right sign. So I'm going to be working on this one later. So basically, what can we conclude from this? It seems that at least there's some good reason to believe that regions that were more democratic during the 1990s set social policy priorities that invested more in health and education. So more sort of universalistic policy areas. In the future, I plan on looking at more specific measurements, more specific indicators than just health spending shares and education spending shares to see how outcomes are related to these. Outcomes in terms of actual social outcomes, so life expectancy, things like that. What's interesting is that, again, this is tentative, but it seems like it's really the regional regime type during the 1990s that matters more than the regional regime type during the early 2000s. So there is some sort of lock-in, at least potentially, to how social policy priorities get set, which actually makes sense. I mean, it seems less likely if you devote 30% of your budget to education in one year that, barring some exceptional circumstance, you're going to, lower that to 5% or 10% the next year. And then just the last sort of point here, another tentative conclusion that I plan on doing some more tests of, but it's that when we disaggregated the Petrov index, the expert measure, into its 10 components, the ones that are most strongly related to these same dependent variables are electoral competition or electoral fairness, and political institutions. I can talk about more about what those measures mean in the questions. And so, what this tells me is that even in the context of sort of 1990s Russia, in which probably no region would fulfill minimal criteria to be considered a real electoral democracy, but some were certainly much more competitive than others, electoral competition did seem to push toward social policy priorities in health and education, rather than more targeted benefits such as pensions. So again, not having run the models for pensions and also communal services yet, I can't say that with much confidence, but that seems to be the direction the evidence is pointing. So with that, there is more to come. And I'm very happy to take questions or advice or questions about the measurements, the theory, anything.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Professor Bull.
Sure. Okay. Where to begin? The business about the more competitive regions would track nicely with Konitzer's data that the regions, when there were elected governors they got rewarded or disciplined for economic performance. Since I've gone to appointed governors, less so. There was a great article in a totally obscure St. Petersburg journal for sociologists called Telescope, where two sociologists totally trashed the expert interview methodology. I mean, it's kind of half a step above Adnababa Skazala, but that's about it. Looking at diversity in the parliament would be a much better variable for the regions. Talked to Raj Desai about resource regions. I think he had, if I remember right, he had an article where they actually did have some data on that. Mm-hmm. The ethnic diversity matches Lily Tsai's work on China very nicely. That's easy to pull in. And I don't want to take too long, but I guess the last thing I'd say is there's an article that I used to assign in my colloquia, but I haven't taught the course for a couple of years, by Nerudin and Simmons on why IMF programs seem to damage public good provision, especially health and education, and their emphasis is the lobbying. That those groups just don't manage to make the claims that the military and some other groups do. I'll send you the article. Now that tracks a little bit with the electoral issue, and that of course is IMF programs. It means you're already in crisis. It works for low-income democracies, and I will stop there because I'm not the only one in the room.
Okay. Should I collect some questions or address them?
Other questions, comments? Otherwise, yeah.
Hello, I've got a question for clarification to discuss a little bit more about the ethnic fractionalization,
Sure.
ethnic diversity. You talked about the correlation with education. Is there much of anything with health? And also, what does it mean that Putin has now suggested that the heads of regions and republics become more competitive by showing that they have better ethnic diversity programs and plans? In other words, bring what you've found a little bit more
Sure.
into the current world.
I'll take one more and then address
Yeah,
it.
I'm just curious to know about how much control there is of the region in terms of acquiring the money for these programs. Because think of something like pensions, where there's very complex law determining what pension you get, and I think it's fairly centralized, and I wonder if that's different from, say, education spending, which may be more of a bottom-up phenomenon.
Okay, yeah, I'll address those in reverse order. Pensions is one of the more centralized programs. And the requirements for kind of pension levels, how they relate to the subsistence level in each region, I think they're fixed in law at the national level. To some degree, pension spending is not determined by the regions. If you look at health and education, regions in Russia, even before 2005, disposed of something like 85% of all social expenditures in Russia. It's actually an extremely decentralized welfare state in many respects. There are sort of national standards for healthcare and education, not always obeyed at the regional level, but they do exist. But the important point is that the regions still have quite a bit of control over which areas they choose to prioritize. Maybe not absolute levels of funds they have available to them, but again, that's why I'm using the measure of budget shares, and that's also why I control for federal transfers, which they do have a negative sign in all the models I've run. They never show up as significant. I could use another measure of federal transfers to get at that, and I will probably do that. To turn to the question about health, if you look at the preliminary model here, it does seem like you have the same, you don't have the same actually, ethnic fractionalization effect. The ethnic fractionalization measure here is actually positive. There was not significant. And the ethnic region status is negative, which interestingly, it was positive in the last one. So again, I don't really have an explanation for why that is. That's something I will pay more attention to as I develop this model further. Clearly this one is not, as sort of clear and complete as the other measures that include more controls and explain more of the variation. But it does seem to be moving in the right direction. As you can see, pensioners per 1,000 population is very strongly correlated with health spending, which makes sense. under 16 population share is correlated with it, at least in the right direction, not significant. And to address the question of sort of regional ethnic diversity more recently, yeah, I definitely think that the situation has changed in many respects recently for several reasons. In 2005, you had the monetization law, which was also a regionalization law, assigned even more groups of beneficiaries to the regions. You saw, actually, there were some regions that simply did not enact the requirements, either because they could not afford to, or because they could afford to continue paying the in-kind benefits that came before. And I will look into, actually, there may be some data available on regional compliance with those policies. It would be interesting to see if there's any relationship between regional ethnic status and sort of degree of compliance with these federal regulations. And then finally, to address the issue of, expert ratings are always unreliable. I think the important point here is that the results are robust to many different measures of democracy. I've only included some of them here. So I have a measure of institutions, which looks at the quality of economic institutions, and the findings are also robust. That measure really relates to kind of security of property rights, corrupt activities of bureaucrats, and so on. So that's interesting because, again, corruption appears weakly significant. When you disaggregate the Petrov index into its 10 parts, each of them is on a range from 1 to 5. So there's not actually that much variation on these variables. So maybe it's just an artifact of that. Hard to tell. And thank you for pointing out the Conitzer point, which I did not think about, but you're exactly right, actually. This could be an interesting tie into that argument about economic performance. And actually, if economic performance were also related to specific social policy priorities, that would be extremely interesting. So I will.
Other questions, comments? I just wanted, so the Petrov Index, obviously, it's for the 90s and the early 2000s. And then obviously ties into all of your other measures. Are there any indices sort of for the more recent period looking at the comparative kind of democratization of different regions in Russia? I would assume that if you look at data for the last couple of years, I guess using the same criteria they did, you'd see something rather different. And then the question would be, how is that going to impact the social policy?
Right. Well, yeah, there are Petrov ratings for. So the thing about the Petrov ratings is, with the exception of the 1991-2001 baseline, they are multi-year averages. They're not really averages in the sense that they don't measure them for individual years. They go in 4-year increments. So 2000, 2004, 2001 to 2005, 2002 to 2006. Why they do it that way, I have no idea.
5-year plans.
It's very strange that they chose to do it that way, but in any case, there are data going up to 2010, or 2006 to 2010. And you do see some significant backsliding, pretty much across the board. I haven't done, just sort of a simple correlation between, say, how democratic a region was in 2000 and how democratic it was in 2006, 2010. That would be interesting to see if, regions not only are becoming less democratic, but at different rates. If you look at the electoral competitiveness index, you can see a little of that, actually. Even between 1999, 2002, and 2003, 2004, there's a pretty significant cooling across the board in large parts of the country, especially in kind of Siberia, some parts of the Urals. And if you look at the highest competitiveness score in the 1999 to 2002 election cycle, it looks like something like 5-6 regions get it. Now it's only 2. Or now in 2003, 2004, it's only 2. It's Nizhny Novgorod and Kaliningrad. I imagine if we were to do it more recently, Kaliningrad would probably have dropped off there, and most likely Nizhny Novgorod as well.
Did any of Robertson's recent articles include this? I'd have to go back and double check.
I've never seen him look at regional regime type. There actually is there's a working paper by a political scientist at the Higher School of Economics, who's a researcher there, and he looks at variation in kind of the size of, I'll send this to you actually, if you're really interested in this. He looks at variation in the size of protests from region to region during the past election cycle. And, you know, size in terms of the share of, you know, the region's population that's participating. Obviously, a protest in Moscow is going to be bigger than a protest in Norilsk. But yeah, and he includes kind of repressiveness of the regional regimes as one of his measures. And unsurprisingly, that is related to...
Does he include Communist Party membership too?
Sorry?
Does he include Communist Party membership? That would be another really interesting indicator.
So he's only looking at the individual level. I agree he's only looking at the regional level, or rather, I agree if we had individual level data and see if the sort of composition of the protests varied from region to region.
No, I just mean in the region.
Oh, okay.
Party. That you can get.
No, he does not control for that, but yeah,
that
would be
would be
interesting measure too.
Okay, enough.
Well, I think you have lots of material for your next big research project, which will be a PhD. So thank you very much.